Zara, for joining us. Thank you very much, Zara, for joining us. So maybe we'll start with a quick round of introductions. I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Hadiza Abba. I am a lawyer, a human rights and gender activist based in Nigeria, and I'm very, very passionate about this discussion that we're about to have this beautiful morning here for me in Abuja and for you in Maiduguri in Nigeria. So it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to you, Zara. The discussion we're going to have today is surrounding access to justice for survivors in conflict. So, in particular, survivors of the Boko Haram uh, induced insurgency, the 15 years long insurgency that has been happening that has affected the northeastern part of the country. Um, and I'm very, very happy for you to be here for us to have this discussion. So, Zara Yakub is she's a practicing Nigerian barrister and a women's rights advocate who is also the current vice chairperson of International Federation of Women Lawyers Borno State Branch in Nigeria. She's been a member since 2015. She is an expert on sexual and gender based violence, particularly in conflict, having handled many cases of survivors of sexual and gender based violence by Boko Haram, even at the peak of the insurgency when swaths of northeastern Nigeria were occupied by these groups, and the justice system had entirely collapsed due to the intensity of the humanitarian crisis, which displaced about 2.7 million people across the Lake Chad Basin in West Africa. So that's part of northeast Nigeria, border with Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. As the head of litigation at FIDA, she rendered free legal representation, especially to women and children affected by the conflict. And she did this by successfully rallying the support and engaging with key actors from government, law enforcement, justice, community and traditional structures, the donor communities, and development agencies. Zara, we're so lucky and pleased to have you. And personally for me, also witnessing your work has been incredibly humbling, and I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation. You're welcome to this discussion.
Thank you, Hadiza. It's my pleasure being with you this morning, and I wish us a very successful and fruitful deliberation. And I'm ready to respond to any issues that I know I have a knowledge or participated in it. I'm equally ready to share all my experiences working in the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So maybe if I could just start by providing a little bit of a background. So as you know, June 19th is commemorated annually as the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. And this year's theme, 2022, is Prevention as Protection, enhancing structural and operational prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. It's within this context that we're having this discussion. So this interview session has been organized by the project that is looking at strengthening access to justice for survivors in conflict, survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, and it's in collaboration with the International Federation of Women Lawyers Borno chapter, and we're very grateful to also acknowledge the technical and financial support from Strategic Advocacy for Human Rights, who have really provided us with a lot of the mentorship and support leading up to the organization of this session today, and of course, very importantly, providing us this platform to be able to amplify, the work, the excellent work that is being carried out by human rights defenders such as yourself, and that is the context for today's discussion. So, my first, and just to also add before going into the questions, is we would the significance of this to explain a little bit about the significance of this exercise, which is really to provide an insight to those working in similar conflict contexts, other human rights defenders, lawyers that might be grappling with, similar challenges on how to represent and promote the human rights of the most vulnerable and often the most overlooked individuals in the context of conflict. And in this case, we're looking at women and girls who were married as wives of Boko Haram. Really, giving them an insight on how, the context of the conflict, the issue of forced marriages that happen within the context. How is this conceptualized under customary and Islamic law? Which is the context within which these marriages were purportedly conducted, and how you have advanced the rights of women by defining these practices as sexual and gender-based violence in order to provide recognition for these crimes and a pathway to recognition and justice for survivors of these acts. So this is really a bit of a background and the context. So we have a total of 8 questions we're going to
All right.
be going through, and each question shouldn't take us more than 5 minutes. The aim is to have this conversation, to complete the questions in 40 minutes, and have the interview done within the hour. So I'll go straight into the first question. Can you briefly explain or give a background that would help us understand, this terrorist group, Boko Haram, what their objectives are, how they swept through territories, capturing, abducting, and unleashing terror on victims and survivors in an entire communities?
All right. Thank you, Hadiza. And I would like to just briefly, as you rightly pointed out, to discuss the objectives of Boko Haram. And you, as an indigenous of the region, you know that the objectives of the Boko Haram is to create a pure Islamic state ruled by Sharia law. That is the objective of the Boko Haram. And then the modus operandi is to use women and children as tactics of weapon of war to actualize their mission in creating the so-called Islamic State, believing that the leadership of the northern part of Nigeria is seized by corrupt false Muslims. That is the belief of the terrorists. And using women and children as their tactics of war is to, achieve and actualize their mission by, taking over the northern part of Nigeria and leading us on that as they believe. And me as a Muslim, I don't believe that the objective of the Boko Haram is in line with the Sharia law, because I'm a student of Sharia law. With the few knowledge that I gathered during my, studies at the university as a Sharia law, there is no way that women and girls can be used as a weapon of war to, rule the states, or to take the territory of the state ruled by Sharia law. That's not I don't believe in that. And I don't believe what the Boko Haram are doing is in line with the Sharia law. And then that's all what I can just say about their objective and how they use women as strategic, uh, approaches, violating the women's right by adopting them, forcibly marrying them to the members, to the fighters, and they forcefully use the women to carry out their activities. They use women as suicide bombers. They use them as sex slaves. All sorts of violations of women's rights in the course of their fight against unleashing the terror attacks on the innocent women in the community and the society.
Thank you very much, Zara, for giving us that very powerful illustration. I think, women generally, have been soft targets, whether they've been victims or whether, they're used as perpetrators. And it really, it helps to give us the context to understand also what roles women, are viewed to, what sort of expected roles are attributed to women, as differently from men within the community. Which really brings me to my
One of
next
the roles
question.
that we
We,
All right. I think we in my own view and my own experience with the activities of the Boko Haram in the region, they use women to play a role, the role of more of a logistic tax. Logistics are such as smuggling ammunitions, they use them to smuggle foods. They play a role of messengers and spices for the organization. Men are more of combatant fighters, and then the role women play is more of and most of this role that the women play are those role played by their own families, not victims. The victims do not play those roles for them, but after associating with them, they persuade them, they make them to play roles, but not all victims adopted play those roles for the terrorists.
and would thank you. Would you say that is linked to the type of roles, the gender roles and responsibilities of women and men in your community? How are women and men viewed differently, especially in this culture? Would you say how Boko Haram operates reflects the expected gender roles and responsibilities of men and women?
Yeah, some of this, women play leadership and combatants. When we are talking about the leadership and the combatants roles, it's the men that play the leadership and the combatants roles. Then the women play female. They were used as suicide bombers. They are used as recruiters. They are also used as in support of roles. You understand? So uh, when I'm talking within the context of the operation of the Boko Haram, here in the Northeast, as I pointed out before, they play the roles of messengers. But when it comes to cultural, women were being seen as a family, as the first contact in the family. They play the uh, the motherly roles because they are the one to serve the family. So that's also the same way the Boko Haram are also classified women. They can only be there to but when it comes to leadership and participation, there is a different role even within the operation of the Boko Haram. The women are not allowed to lead. They are not allowed to fight. They can only be used as messengers, as spies for organization. They can smuggle. That means there is different role men and women play in even the oppression.
Thank you. So it's very clear that men and women have very different expectations when it
Yes.
comes to the kind of roles that they would ordinarily be expected to play within the context of the terrorist group, and that that also mirrors what the norm within the society.
Yeah.
But of course, we also know of certain terrorist groups, from different contexts, where women indeed played lead roles, within the context of these groups. But the case, it's very good for us to be clarified that the case is different here.
Yes.
So then my next question would be, what are the peculiar factors? What are those factors that mostly, predispose women and girls, to forced marriages and abduction. You spoke about um, the tactic of the terrorist groups being, abducting women, forcefully marrying them so that they can expand, the ummah, as they call it, they expand their following. That is, all in line with, their objectives of setting up, an Islamic state, as they call it. So my question then would be, from your own view, what are those factors, whether economic, socioeconomic, cultural, religious, that might, fuel, such conduct from the terrorist groups that predispose women to such vulnerabilities?
Yes, these are you know that women are vulnerable here. Looking at the cultural, practices, most of these women living in the villages, they don't go to school, they don't have access to education, they don't have anything doing. They were at home, cooking. Rather, sometimes during farming, they go to farming. I think the vulnerability is also one of the factors that predispose these women to be adopted, or rather to be, forcefully married by the Boko Haram. And then when we look at the other factors, women are so, so vulnerable. That is it. That's the only word I can use. And there is no adequate protection as to their right, and they were looked at gender. So their gender is also one of the factors that made them to be, victims, because they would be used to, be forcefully married. They are young girls, they are virgin. So these are some of the uh, being a female gender. That is also another factor.
Thank you. So, indeed, the factors are multidimensional. We
Yes.
look at the privations; they're cross-cutting. You look at education, you look at economic empowerment, poverty, the gendered roles that have been attributed, or the expectations from women to play certain specific roles within community, which, indeed predisposes them to these vulnerabilities. All are contributing factors. And I think for us, it's very important to establish this. And look at, as we move from this discussion of looking at Boko Haram wives as, how they're viewed within within the criminal context, within the criminal justice context, as being associates of Boko Haram as opposed to victims. So I think this is very important to create this, to establish this background. So in this case, then, what can I ask you, from your experience, how the state has approached the issue of women, Boko Haram wives? How have they distinguished the whether, it's a context, within the context of a forced marriage? Is this looked at as a background, or do they just view them as Boko Haram wives? How has the state responded to this particular phenomenon?
So, the state has made a very good approach as to profiling, you know, by identifying victims and then that of associates of Boko Haram, because they were also being, guided by the best practices to ensure that those victims are actually identified as victims. So I think the government is making effort to ensure that victims are identified as victims, and then the associate are also identified as associate. But that has to be in line with the best practices. So we are also working with the government to ensure that those victims are actually identified, and I don't think there is issue or problem in that regard or aspect. But the only thing that I understand is that those victims are not adequately or, sufficiently, or, addressed their specific needs as victims. So this is what I noticed and what I observed, because the few survivors of Boko Haram that recently, escaped from captivity, they were not even rescued. They escaped by themselves. They were in captivities for almost 1 year and, some months. So they were able to manage and escaped. So when they were rescued they reached to a military formation, they surrendered themselves as victims that were managed to escape from captivity. They were taken to the authority concerned, but they were released and united back to their family, but there was nothing done as to their, compensation, or at least, to support them with something to, at least address their immediate specific needs. So we women-led organization, we felt we should, tax ourselves and then support those women. We did it by our own willingness. So I think there is need to, come up with something to address this issue of insufficient attention or neglect to those victims.
Thank you very much. I think you touch on a very important aspect, which is, rehabilitation and compensation for survivors, overall within the conflict. But I want us to take a step back to consider the approach of handling cases of Boko Haram wives, and we've heard about the case of Adama Mustafa, who was a young woman married to a Boko Haram fighter that was in captivity. Well, was in custody, prison custody, for over for 12 months, while she was pregnant, together with her children. And this, she was the only evidence that the security authorities had was, she was the wife of a Boko Haram fighter. And indeed, she was arrested in lieu of this fighter, because they weren't able to reach him. So we're just trying to look at the different types of vulnerabilities that these women suffer, and it's just to understand really whether the state has a very clear cut criteria in identifying those who are forcefully married, so that they don't their rights are not infringed upon by virtue of the fact that they are wives of terrorist groups. Indeed, there are cases where these marriages didn't happen forcefully, like in the case of Adama Mustafa, who was legally married and already had children with him. But do you think, as a human rights defender, that women such as Adama Mustafa need to be handled differently by authorities?
No, Adiza, we as lawyers, we know that uh, we have to be always looking at the rights, rights to, uh, presumption of innocence when it comes to believing that someone is associated with Boko Haram. If she as a human being, before uh, uh, keeping her, in a custody, there needs to, that issue of gender responsive approach is another challenge in our institutions, like the correctional services and other detention facilities. As a female, they need to, has to right to their her dignity, rights to, protection. Either she's a victim or she's a wife to Boko Haram, she could be either forcefully married, or she could be if an associate, or she can be, there are issues on this issue of Boko Haram. Is a very complex issue, because some of these women, they don't even have the idea or knowledge that their husbands are really Boko Haram. Because I came across a case where a woman is married to a Boko Haram, but she doesn't know that the husband is a Boko Haram, until when they came to attack their community, the husband came home and then took her away with the children to the bush. You understand? So this issue of keeping them in the detention facility, uh, you know, handling them like terrorists, sometimes it may, violate their rights as females. So because they are entitled to be in a form of gender responsive, intervention. So these are some of the issues we have to, as human rights lawyers, look into consideration. We don't see them as associates. We see them as women that are supposed to be, handled in a way and manner supposed to be, handled in line with their rights as a human being, not as associates.
Thank you so much. I think keep all this in mind, then, what does reconciliation, rehabilitation, and reintegration look like for women such as Boko Haram wives after decades of conflict? We've looked at the different categories, of association with Boko Haram, in cases of forced marriages, in cases where, women were legally married and, and legally married and, with full choice and full consent. What does reconciliation look like going forward?
The reconciliation is very simple to me. When we look at marriage, even though I'm not part of the processes, I'm not carried out to be in the process but we as trained experts in that aspect, I can share my understanding and what is going on, even though I'm not part of the process, but I am aware of how this reintegration, reconciliation is going on in the state. And we have seen some of these uh, non-compliance with the norms, with the best practices, as for effective DDR measures. Why I said so, because experts are not carried out in the entire processes. Some of those people working in the camps uh, are really making complaint how the process is being carried out, because those women, most of them that were forcefully married, from looking at it in the Islamic perspective, there is no marriage from the beginning. Why there is no marriage from the beginning? Because all the essential elements Islamically recognized for a valid marriage between husband and wife is not in compliance, because those people were forcefully married out. When they come back to the society, the husbands may fear those women to come back to them. Some do accept their wives, but some fear those women for staying longer in the hands of the Boko Haram. So looking at the situation, in some cases it becomes easy to reconcile them, from what I was told, and in some cases it's difficult to reconcile. And the entire reintegration process is not done in line with the international based practices. That is what we were made to know. And then when it comes to right to reparation, right to redress, those women were not informed about those rights. They are not informed, they are not aware, and they were not even aware that there are organizations that can render free legal representation to them. So that means there are gaps in assessing justice. And assessing justice is also one of the strategic approach in countering violent extremism. So these are some of the gaps that even the state actors need to be aware, need to be involved, need to know that those victims need to know their right to information, as to their right to reparation and right to redress and access to justice. These are not adequately carried out in the entire processes as far as my knowledge is concerned.
That's great. You touch on a lot of things, and one of the key things you talked about is knowledge of access to justice. How aware, are these survivors, categories of women, about the kinds of rights that are afforded to them, not just under international law, but under some of our local laws that recognize the right to compensation to victims of crime. So, can you tell me a little bit about what the perception of justice of these victims are? These do they have what are they what do they consider to be victims within the context of their suffering? Would you say that access
Actually,
to justice is one of them? And if not,
yes. No, access to justice is one of them, but assessing justice to those victims is the challenge. How? Uh, you know, most of these organizations like mine, FIDA, and other human rights respondents, they have their own, you know, limitation while trying to assess justice as to the course of action. Because as I pointed out, those rights are not known to those victims. And you as a human rights respondent, you cannot just go to court and start, uh, you know, uh, demanding for the rights of victims without being the victims, consenting to access justice. And then the ability to access justice is one of the rights of the is one of the rights to equality and protections, in promoting the cause of rule of law. So if we want to assess justice to those victims, I think as human rights lawyers, we need to engage those survivors. We need to make them understand that they have a right and they can actually ask for those rights, even in our domestic laws, because the domestic laws have provided some, have defined some of these offenses, even though it's restrictive, but it has defined some of these activities, or the activities of the Boko Haram on women, like that of sexual and gender-based violence, because most of the actions and the commission of those crimes by Boko Haram is on women and children. There is this rare case of rape because those women were forcefully married. So you can establish a case of rape, and we have rape in our domestic laws. We can prosecute them under, but the issue is that, can we prosecute them under the state's courts? No. You know, is we cannot, because the state laws doesn't have jurisdiction or power to try uh, terrorism related offenses, because it's not within its jurisdiction. So there's need to do more to establish special courts, those victims to know their rights so that they can access justice. If those things are not put, those mechanisms are not put in place, I don't think we as human rights activists, we can access justice. But we can do it, but we need to do more to, formalize and, regularize some of these procedural and jurisdictional, gaps.
there's something that you said that is of very high significance, and that is the lack of awareness
Yes.
amongst survivors. We've looked at the profile of these women. What typically you know, you know, their circumstances will be, not having access to education. So indeed, it's very critical, you know, to create awareness. And I just want to pick on one of the activities recently that took place, that you know, FIDA conducted interviews with the survivors of sexual and gender-based violence by Boko Haram. And the purpose of this interview sessions was indeed to understand their experiences of the crimes, and, you know, other experiences, what factors led to them being in the circumstances, their perceptions of justice, but also very importantly, it was an opportunity to, you know, inform them, to create awareness to them that you know, they have rights under international human rights mechanisms that, you know, Nigeria as a state has domesticated, and, you know, that are enforceable. And they were also asked if, you know, they were told that there is a cause of action. They have a cause of action under within these frameworks, whether they would indeed want to pursue justice. And the overwhelming majority said that they would. So I think this is very encouraging. This is a very positive practice that, you know, FIDA has taken the lead on, and it's the sort of initiatives, innovation that indeed is required, you know, in this to in this circumstance, to provide you know, sort of justice for these survivors. I thought it was very important to point this out. But is there something that you would like to share from this exercise? Anything that you would like to shed more light on before, you know, we go to our final question?
Yeah, you know, and we've been working with those victims for long, and then all their concern is to is you know the livelihood is also another issue that is their concern, because what I'm saying, looking at their numbers, you know, looking at the crisis that has bedeviled the state for long, the government also, you know, cry that there is no enough resources to adequately, you know, or sufficiently address some of these livelihood interventions. So the government is also trying. So what I'm looking at this is, you know, those women, they really need attention, and they really need to be aware that they have a right to, you know, to seek for redress, to, without seeking those rights, the government will never pay attention to them, and their rights to access to justice will be denied. So I think it is our collective, responsibility as human rights activists, as women's rights respondents, to ensure we inform them about those rights. We lead them to access justice as to the violation of their rights, so as to pick up to their life.
Thank you. There's something you mentioned earlier also about prevention. Prevention as a key way to you know, respond to the to respond to the insurgency. Are there any preventative and protective measures, whether it's formal and informal, that can be used to ensure that affords protection to women and girls, you know, against sexual and gender-based violence, in particular forced marriages and abduction?
So as far as I'm concerned, you know, I can't say there is no protection, but it can't be adequate.
Right. It's
You know, these women need to be empowered. They were not sufficiently empowered. These people are still vulnerable. There's likelihood that if the terrorist or any other person is trying to persuade them, exploit them, because their attention is not given to them, they can easily be persuaded, or they can easily go back or join, or as may likely wish to associate with the terrorists. So the issue of empowerment of those women, aside from assessing the justice, there's need to empower them. There's need to pay more attention to them, because the neglect is also what I observed. Those victims were neglected. They were not even recognized by some of those respondents, because they only respond to the entire IDPs that were displaced, without looking at those victims that were victims of the SGBV, looking at those that came with their children, those that have Boko Haram children. Is there anything done to them as victims? To my knowledge, I can't say there is one. I didn't witness any intervention for those victims. So I can say that they were neglected. So there needs to come up with interventions to pay attention to their specific needs, so as to prevent them from any further, uh, falling a victim. Because apart from the Boko Haram, perpetrators, we have other perpetrators too, that also, see them and take the advantage of their vulnerability, and then commit another act of SGBV on them. Because I have came across a case whereby a woman was forcefully adopted by Boko Haram, forcefully married. She was managed to escape. When she escaped and came back to the society as an IDP living in a host community, when she was staying in a community where there are young youths, that are also, these perpetrators. So they raped her. It was a gang rape against her by some group of youths. So they impregnated her. You can see the trauma in her. After escaping from Boko Haram, she came back and she was not given attention. She was raped by another group of youths and impregnated her. She was pregnant, and she was referred to our organization. As at that time, our organization did what we can do, but we have our own limitation. There is no way we can reach out to those in authority to at least look into her problem. When you get to them, they will also complain. She's not alone. We have many others. We have our own challenges. This is also what we also face.
So you talk about you also touch on the political will, and I think that's very
Yes,
important.
yes,
When we look at how to prevent future occurrence, how to ensure the institutions, the structures, the attitudes to, the sufferings that have been perpetrated within the context of conflict, how these are going to be addressed, how these are going to be how the state is going to respond to it in a way that identifies the different categories of survivors, victims. In particular, also you talked about how these survivors of SGBV by Boko Haram also not be getting the kind of attention and recognition, within the context of overall response to the situation of conflict. I think these are all very critical issues that you've identified, and going forward, will need to be not only amplified, but also it needs to be systematically addressed, in the policies that are being used to respond to um, to ensure rehabilitation, reintegration within overall um, uh, prevention and prevention of conflict and violent extremism efforts. So all these are very critical. So my last question then is, what next? What next? How is FIDA going to what role does FIDA see for itself in carving out, a space whereby women, women and girls who are survivors of sexual and gender-based violence receive the needed recognition that is gender responsive, that you talk about. What role is FIDA going to play going forward? Thank you.
FIDA is an organization of female lawyers that were called to practice law in Nigeria, and is an organization that promotes the right of women and children, and also promote the international legal framework to ensure that rights of women and children are preserved, protected, and promoted. So I think FIDA as an organization needs to, uh, create awareness and engage all actors to, to take the responsibility of gender dimension of criminal justice responses to terrorism, just to us to address the needs of those victims, and also promote the cause of justice by allowing those women to access justice. How do we do that? We can only do that by, engaging all stakeholders, bringing all the stakeholders to understand the cause of justice, access to justice to victims of sexual and gender-based violence, and also the need to pay attention. So because access to justice is another way to address and counter violent extremism. By not allowing those people to have the ability to access justice is another way of prolonging and, promoting the cause of these terrorist activities. So we need to engage them to be informed, to be aware, to know that those rights are responsibility of all actors, and it requires multifaceted approach to address it. How do we do it? FIDA will take a lead, and then will ensure that we carry out activities, programs, and then we, disseminate messages, communicate, and then relate any important issues that we need to, because why I'm saying this, because Adiza, you are aware that FIDA, I in particular, took part in, reviewing the National Action Plan. We also participated in the UNODC programs on gender dimension and criminal justice responses to terrorism. We took part in, reviewing the module training, documents. So these documents are available and is in our disposals. We need to, engage actors to know more about gender responsive approaches, because I see those interventions, these technical supports that were given to participants by UNODC the training was not stepped down to those actors. Those actors are not aware. Some are not even working with the National Action Plan. There are a lot of things that FIDA and other organization will do to engage actors from different sectors to know those interventions as key in countering and, preventing violent extremism in Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is all the time we have for this interview, but I would like to sincerely appreciate you for your time. In spite of the challenges, it's a weekend, and the connectivity challenges, but we're so thrilled that we could have this opportunity to hear from you firsthand on the work that you're doing and the center stage that FIDA is taking on ensuring access to justice for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence by terrorist groups within the context of the conflict in northeast Nigeria. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your passion, for the work that you do. And I would also like to thank, very importantly, Sahar, Strategic Advocacy for Human Rights, for providing this platform for us to really project some of the key and arising issues that will be very instructive as we go forward in this area of work. Thank you so much, Barrister Zara Yakub. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Hadiza. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.